you guys are going to have to watch your video after the written exam. We're going to do a little reflection day, and you get to watch yourself. Okay? All right, Cedric, are you ready?
Yes.
Is everyone ready to hear Cedric's presentation?
Right. So,
ready? Go
okay.
ahead.
Okay, so what I have done for this project is I have researched millennials, robots, and our economic future in the US. So I started this research project by looking at the stimulus packet, and in it there was the source, A World Without Work, from The Atlantic. In it, it talked about how automation is coming and how it is possibly a large risk to our economy. And from this, I wondered, so what are the actual possible impacts to our future economy in the US? And what I found was that there is robotics, in which it would impact the economy by creating an upcoming automation of work, therefore displacing jobs. And it might also possibly cause a drastic shift in welfare provision. The other thing I considered was millennials, who would be the new workforce and have gone down the path of labor specialization. And as can be known, if you were to look at some articles, for example, in Gallup, you would find that they actually have some fairly different work habits and work ethics compared to previous generations. So my question is, will automation and millennials have a positive impact on the US economy? So firstly, automation is happening. It has, as can be seen from A World Without Work, as I've stated before, also an estimated 800,000 jobs in the UK from 2001 to 2016 have been taken up by robots. Also seen in the graph here, industrial robots have been on the rise in most industries, most notably in the automotive parts industry. This isn't to say, though, that automation will take away all jobs immediately. As can be seen in the same article where that graph came from, it talked about how, although there is an increase in industrial robots, there was also an increase in manufacturing jobs. This can also be found in the TEDx talk by David Otter, in which he talked about, since the introduction of the ATM in 1970, the number of bank tellers employed in the USA has increased by roughly 3,500,000 as of 2016. Due to the fact that automation will gradually take over jobs and leave more and more people unemployed, albeit at a slow rate, economic policies should be revised to accommodate for the incoming unemployed. Programs to retrain those who were previously in manufacturing and have been unemployed could be done to give them a more humanitarian focus, for example, making them teachers or elderly caregivers. You could also give a universal basic income if there is enough, which would allow people to pursue greater risks in work. I will talk about this later. As you can see by the cartoon, robots currently do not pay tax. This is quite the problem, as when robots take up jobs, the government will therefore lose an income from those jobs, because that is a form of income for a person, and that person will no longer be able to pay that income tax. If a robot were to be taxed, as supported by Bill Gates, who says you ought to be willing to raise a tax level and even slow down the speed, but if you're to tax a robot according to minimum wage and so on and so forth, if they were to work a 16-hour job, they would be taxed approximately 15,500 American dollars, which isn't too much for a robot, and it could be increased. A flaw with taxing robots, though, is defining where to actually define what to tax the robot for, or more easily said would be, should we tax certain AIs, and which AIs should we tax? For example, you have AIs such as calculators and algorithms, but then you also have AIs that write articles, and you have industrial robots. Now, as I've mentioned before, there is something called a universal basic income. What this would do is it would provide a basic state-provided income to every single citizen. And this could be this would be regardless of occupation. Say if you were unemployed or if you were the richest man in that country, you would still have that income. There have been trials found in Finland, Scotland, and Oakland, USA. And as you can see by the picture, that is one of the Finnish people who was found under the program. He was previously unemployed, but has now been able to find work by being able to pursue jobs, as when he was unemployed, a flaw that happened was those who were unemployed could not actually pursue jobs because they would risk losing all of their benefits for a substantial amount of time, which would leave them quite vulnerable. But with the UBI, they were able to pursue jobs, and even small jobs, and be able to be more productive. Now this moves on to the people who will have to cope with the new policies as well as the rise of automation, which is millennial workers. Now, according to Gallup, which is a business advisory statistic group, 60% are open to new jobs, and this can lead to job hopping and freelancing. It is also noted that with those millennials, they are also less connected to their companies and are more open to working with other companies in the future. Now, going on to freelancers. Freelancers has been on the rise. It now makes up 35% of the US workforce, and it is seen as a more project-based workforce, and it goes into labor specialization. Now, freelancers can be seen beneficial towards companies that have project-based things. For example, if you have tech startups, then if you hire freelancers, they will be able to manage that job quite well, and it will be cheaper than employees, as employees will require training, among other things such as benefits. Meanwhile, freelancers do not require that. With a freelancer, there will be labor specialization, in which they will specifically train themselves in one specific area of their job, and then that will allow the best man for the job to be hired for the job, which will just prove to be quite beneficial in the future for important projects. So what is our economic future? Well, it's hard to say exactly right now, as there is the possibility that due to automation, companies will create a larger disparity of the classes, and this would eventually set up the economy for failure. But there's also the fact to consider that there would likely be stresses on the markets as they go through the changes through automation and with millennials. But if it is done correctly, the economy would lead to great improvement with specialized laborers and automated sectors, which would lead to quite a gradual increase in the economy over time. Thank you.
So, Cedric, can you describe for us some strategies that you use to find information to answer your research question?
So some of the strategies that I used was, first I would go for a fairly broad research question at first. And so as I mentioned before, I started just with what are some of the impacts in the economy. Then from that, I would find topics to go into. And then from those topics, I would then find an article. And normally speaking, if the article is credible, then the author would have written about other parts or other aspects of the problem. And so what I did occasionally was I would look at the author and look at the other parts that he had written about, and then I would use those as sources as well. For example, the source that I used for freelancing, I actually found by looking at what millennials did in an article.
So what do you see, your question was whether or not automation and millennials had a positive impact on the economy.
Mm-hmm.
So did you consider kind of the opposing point of view? Like, what do you, in the broader context, right, did you consider kind of the opposite point of view?
I did consider the possibility of millennials and automation creating a negative impact on the economy. And for example, if you were to look at a world without work, it did talk about how automation could lead to negative growth. It was hard to find that much information on millennials. It's sort of a new point of research. But when it came to considering the other perspective, I did look at it, and this really came into the research question as when I asked the research question, I was making it more of a yes or no with a bit of an argument by focusing more on the positive side. And if I found that it wouldn't be positive, then I would just say, no, it's going to be negative.
So you're saying it would have altered your answer?
It would have if there had been more